Winter was the coldest season of the year. Spring brought the heaviest frosts and seemed to stretch on with the longest, chilly days. Summer filled the skies with the brightest sunshine, and that was when the heat was at its strongest. Harvest was the most blessed season because it rewarded people with the crops that God had provided throughout the year. Those words come from Maxims, an anonymous Anglo-Saxon poem. Back in the Middle Ages, the changing seasons shaped almost every part of daily life. Since most people were peasants, they depended on farming and the natural cycle of the land to survive. Every season came with its own responsibilities, challenges, and way of life. When spring finally arrived, people headed back into the fields to begin planting their crops after the long winter. Summer brought long, hot days, but nobody had the luxury of taking it easy. As the grain ripened beneath the blazing sun, everyone stayed busy working through the exhausting days of harvest. Once autumn arrived, the focus shifted to gathering the remaining crops, storing food, and getting everything ready for the cold months that were sure to come. Then winter settled over the villages, covering everything in darkness and bitter cold, forcing most work indoors until the weather finally changed. Today, I'm going to take you back to the Middle Ages so we can see how every season came with its own hard work, traditions, and routines. Life in that farming world depended entirely on keeping pace with nature, and survival meant following the rhythm of the seasons like a clock. As the old saying goes, there is a season for everything. Believe it or not, in England, people didn't always recognize the 4 seasons the way we do today. During the Anglo-Saxon period and earlier, the old Celtic calendar divided the year into only 2 parts, summer and winter. These days, most people living in temperate climates think of the year as 4 clear seasons. Spring covers March, April, and May. Summer runs through June, July, and August. Autumn includes September, October, and November. Then winter arrives with the cold, dark months of December, January, and February. That familiar 4-season system is actually much newer than most people realize. It wasn't officially standardized until 1780, when the Societas Meteorologica Palatina defined the meteorological seasons according to temperature instead of traditional customs. In the Middle Ages, every person experienced the passing seasons in their own way. Whether someone was a king, a laborer, a farmer, or a monk, the rhythm of each month was shaped by the work that needed to be done. Even so, there were parts of the yearly cycle that affected everyone, regardless of their social standing. The agricultural calendar mattered far more to medieval people than it does to most of us today. Everyone depended on successful harvests, so the growth of crops, the arrival of rain, and the hope, or fear, of the coming harvest touched every household. Even kings kept a close eye on the fields because they knew their armies could only march once the grain had been safely harvested and enough food had been stored. For most of the Middle Ages, nearly everyone also lived according to the Church's religious calendar. Periods of fasting, joyful feasts, and the observance of holy days were shared by the entire population. These traditions weren't optional or based on personal preference. The Church established them, and royal authority helped enforce them. Rich and poor alike entered Lent together, celebrated Easter and Christmas together, and paused their work on the same saints' feast days. Just as the changing seasons guided life on the land, the religious calendar shaped the rhythm of everyday life as well. Throughout the year, holidays brought welcome breaks from the long months of hard labor. Many of these celebrations had originally been pagan festivals that the Church adopted, often changing very little about the traditions themselves. From one harvest to the next, every season included at least one important celebration. During harvest time, people observed 2 feasts dedicated to the Virgin Mary that fell less than a month apart. On those special days, work came to a stop, farming tools were set aside, village greens filled with games and laughter, and tables were covered with generous meals of meat, cakes, and plenty of ale. Spring's promise. When March arrived, farmers hoped for dry weather and frost-free mornings so they could finally begin plowing their fields and spreading manure. It was also the right time to tackle outdoor jobs like pruning fruit trees and trimming grapevines before the growing season was fully underway. As April brought its familiar pattern of rain showers followed by warm sunshine, people started harrowing the fields and sowing their seeds. Once the danger of frost had passed and the soil had warmed enough, planting could move ahead in earnest. The first weeks of spring also marked the beginning of lambing. As winter slowly released its grip, and before the busiest planting work began, sheep gave birth to their lambs. The young animals were perfectly timed to graze on the leftover stubble in last year's wheat fields, feeding on the remains of the previous harvest. By the middle of June, spring had given way to warm, sunny weather. That was when sheep were sheared, and their freshly cut fleeces were loaded onto carts and taken to market to be sold. One of the best first-hand descriptions of this work comes from Jean de Brie, a 14th-century shepherd. In 1379, he dictated a guide that was later translated as The Medieval Shepherd. It became one of the earliest practical manuals explaining how to care for sheep throughout the changing seasons. Writing about spring, he explained, "In May, when the weather is fair and calm and not yet too hot, everything on earth is in full flower. It is then that the pastures are filled with tender plants. In May, it is customary to shear the wool from rams, ewes, yearlings, and lambs because the wool is ready. It is far more profitable to shear sheep at that time than at any other, both because of the season's moderate warmth and because grazing is easier." April also brought an important tradition to many English villages. As neighboring communities gradually expanded and their boundaries became more important, people took part in the annual spring gang days, when the entire village walked the edges of its parish to confirm and remember its borders. During these processions, young boys were often dipped into boundary streams or gently bumped against old trees, stones, and other landmarks that marked the parish limits. The unusual custom was meant to make those locations unforgettable, so the children would remember them for the rest of their lives and eventually pass that knowledge on to the next generation. While ordinary villagers focused on farming, the nobility looked elsewhere for seasonal guidance. Princes and influential nobles in 14th and 15th century Western Europe often consulted the Taquinum Sanitatis, a well-known guide to health and daily living. The book was originally based on the work of the 11th century physician Ibn Butlan of Baghdad, who offered advice for every season of the year. He described spring as being naturally hot and moderately wet. He also believed that spring was beneficial for animals and for everything growing from the earth. At the same time, he warned that the season could be harmful to people with wet bodies because, in his view, it encouraged decay. For that reason, he recommended cleansing the body during spring, believing it would produce healthy humors and an abundance of fresh blood. Summer's Lullaby. According to Bartholomew Anglicus in his 13th century encyclopedia. On the properties of things, summer was the hot and dry season of the year, lasting for 3 months. June marked the beginning of haymaking, the first major task in the long harvest season. Hay was every bit as valuable as grain because it provided the feed that livestock would need to survive the coming winter. At the same time, it was incredibly easy to lose. Just a few days of damp weather, heavy mist, or an unexpected rainstorm could turn freshly cut, sweet-smelling grass into a rotting pile. Because so much depended on it, peasants worked with constant care. They cut the grass with scythes, spread it across the fields to dry beneath the summer sun, turned it again, and gathered it under cover before nightfall. They understood that the survival of their strongest and most valuable animals during winter depended on how well the hay was dried and stored. It was exhausting, backbreaking labor that demanded long hours and tremendous effort. By July, nearly everyone was busy in the wheat fields gathering the fully ripened grain. Medieval illuminated manuscripts often show peasants hard at work, Some stripped to the waist as sweat glistened across their backs while they reaped wheat and threshed grain under the blazing sun. A successful wheat harvest was essential because medieval society constantly lived with the threat of hunger. One poor harvest could push an entire community toward famine, making every day in the fields critically important. Even though summer brought the crops people depended on, it also carried serious dangers. To avoid the worst of the heat, many workers rose before dawn so they could accomplish as much as possible before the afternoon sun became unbearable. That helped reduce the risk of heat exhaustion and severe sunburn, both of which could become life-threatening. Still, no amount of careful planning could protect people from the seasonal illnesses that spread through villages during the warmer months. Disease, including outbreaks of plague, became a constant concern throughout the summer. At the same time, drought could wither crops before they were ready to harvest, destroying months of hard work. The dry weather also created another deadly threat. Fires could race through parched fields and timber-built towns with terrifying speed, leaving destruction behind them. The very same summer sun that ripened the wheat and promised a good harvest could just as easily destroy everything people had worked so hard to grow. Autumn's Reverie. Do you remember the poem I mentioned at the beginning? It spoke about the harvest using the Old English word herfest, which is the language in which the manuscript was originally written. During the early and high Middle Ages, that was the name people used for the season we now call autumn. The word autumn didn't begin to appear until the late 14th century, while the word fall came even later, becoming common around the middle of the 16th century. September marked the high point of the harvest season, when months of hard work finally paid off. One of the best-known medieval manuscripts, Les Très Riches Heures, created in 15th century France for the Duke of Berry, illustrates September as the season of the grape harvest. Once the grapes had been picked, people turned their attention to crushing them and preparing barrels to store the wine. It was an important job that had to be completed before the season changed. By this point, the fields that had demanded constant labor since June were finally bare, neat, and orderly. If fortune had been kind, the barns were now filled with grain, hay, and animal fodder, while stacks of freshly cut straw waited to be used throughout the winter months. October brought the final plowing of the year, giving the land one last preparation before the cold weather arrived. Then, in November, people gathered acorns from the forest to feed and fatten their pigs before they were slaughtered for meat. Families also spent these weeks preparing for winter in every way they could. Vegetables, fruits, berries, and nuts were carefully preserved, pickled, or stored so there would be enough food to last through the long, difficult months ahead. Winter's Serenade. Then came winter, the season that Bartholomew Anglicus described as cold and moist. Today, winter might simply mean staying warm by the fireplace while watching the snow fall through a window. For people living in the Middle Ages, though, it was something much more serious. Winter was a season to survive, not one to enjoy. A single stretch of bitter cold could push an entire family toward hunger or even death. If the previous harvest had been poor, food supplies quickly ran low, and starvation became a real possibility. Hunger, combined with damp living conditions, weakened people's bodies, making illnesses like influenza and pneumonia especially deadly. To stay as warm as possible inside their drafty homes, peasants kept on their heavy wool clothing even indoors. Cloaks, scarves, mittens, and layers of linen helped trap what little warmth they could. At night, animals were often brought inside, not only to protect them from freezing, but also because their body heat helped warm the house. Pottage remained the everyday meal throughout the year, but it became even more important during winter. Almost anything edible could be added to the pot, including vegetables, herbs, and whatever ingredients were available. Around this time, the pigs that had been fattened during the autumn were slaughtered, and the meat was salted or cured, so it would last for months. Salted pork and fatty bacon were especially valuable because they added both flavor and much-needed nourishment to the stew. Right in the middle of the hardships came the year's biggest celebration, Christmas. Lasting for 12 days, from Christmas Eve through Epiphany on January 6th, it offered a welcome break from the struggles of daily life. Many tenants hoped they would be invited to the manor house, where they could share in the Lord's generous Christmas feast. When heavy snow covered the countryside, outdoor work slowed considerably. Even so, life never stopped. Women focused on tasks that could be done indoors beside the fire, including weaving cloth and making baskets. Winter may have slowed the pace of life, but the work of surviving continued every single day. A medieval farm demanded constant attention, even during the coldest months of the year. As February gave way to March, manure had to be spread across gardens and fields to prepare the soil for spring planting. Hardy vegetables like cabbages and leeks could still be harvested from the frozen ground and added to the family pot. There was always something that needed repairing. Buildings, fences, wagons, tools, and farm equipment all required maintenance before another growing season could begin. Firewood had to be gathered, chopped, and stacked, while the animals, pigs, sheep, goats, cows, and chickens, needed feeding, watering, and their shelters cleaned every day, no matter how cold it became. The cycle of the 4 seasons gave medieval people a natural way of measuring time. The church's feast days broke up the long months with colorful processions through village lanes. Lent brought weeks of fasting and quiet reflection before Easter arrived with joyful ceremonies and plentiful feasting. In April, villagers walked the boundaries of their parish during the annual beating of the bounds. September echoed with the sounds of grapes being crushed for wine, while November was remembered for the demanding work of slaughtering pigs. Then December returned with its harsh winter weather, balanced by the warmth and celebration of Christmas around the fire. These seasonal traditions surrounded medieval people wherever they went. They appeared in paintings on church walls, carvings on choir stalls, beautifully illustrated prayer books, and the folk songs that were passed from one generation to the next. Together, they reminded everyone that life followed the same steady rhythm year after year, shaped by the land, the church, and the changing seasons. Thank you for coming along with me on this journey through the medieval year. I hope you enjoyed exploring how the seasons shaped everyday life for the people of the Middle Ages. If you enjoyed the story, I'd love for you to join me again for another look into history. Until next time, take care, and I hope you have a great week.